What does it mean to be safe? Not just behind walls or armed guards or anonymous names, but truly safe. For those who agree to stand against the darkest forces in society, the answer is rarely simple. In the shadows of law and justice, 10 individuals made a choice: to speak, to reveal, to testify. Each was promised protection by the systems meant to uphold truth. Each was betrayed, not by their enemies, but by the very institutions sworn to shield them. This is not a story about crime alone. It is about trust, and how fragile that trust becomes when the guardians themselves are compromised. John McIntyre was the son of a Boston fisherman caught between two worlds. On one side, the murky undercurrents of organized crime. On the other, the shining promise of justice. In 1981, he chose the latter, stepping into a quiet interview room to tell federal agents what he knew about drug shipments, weapons sent to the IRA, and the inner workings of Boston's most dangerous criminal networks. The FBI told him he would be safe, that his identity would remain confidential until trial, that he was doing the right thing. But the rot ran deep. James Whitey Bulger, the infamous crime lord McIntyre had implicated, wasn't just another name on a federal watch list. He was also a prized FBI informant. His handler, Agent John Connolly, wasn't just a man with a badge. He was a childhood friend of Bulger's. And he didn't just protect Bulger. He worked for him, feeding him details of ongoing investigations, witness lists, surveillance operations, and eventually the name of the man who had dared to speak the truth. In November 1984, John McIntyre was summoned under false pretenses to a quiet house in South Boston. He expected a new beginning. Instead, he found Bulger and his enforcers waiting. They knew everything, not guesses, not rumors, but precise details only the FBI could have shared. McIntyre was tortured, interrogated, then executed. His body vanished into the soil of Dorchester, lost for over a decade. It was not until the early 2000s, when Bulger's own lieutenants turned state's evidence, that the truth clawed its way back into daylight. The murder had not been a mistake or a failure of security. It had been an inside job. A betrayal orchestrated from within the very heart of federal law enforcement. This is how our story begins, not with a conspiracy, but with a question. If justice cannot protect those who serve it, what becomes of justice itself? The case of John McIntyre is not an isolated tragedy. It is the first echo in a chorus of betrayals that stretch across countries, decades, and institutions. From Boston to Palermo, from Mexico City to London, the pattern repeats. Witnesses come forward, authorities promise sanctuary, and somewhere along the line, information leaks. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's ideology. But the result is always the same. They die, not all at once, not in a single event, but as a slow erosion of trust, one witness at a time. This documentary is not about what the witnesses knew. It is about what their deaths reveal, that even the strongest walls can be hollow. That protection is only as good as the hands that uphold it, and that the most dangerous betrayal is not the one you see coming, but the one that comes wearing a badge, bearing a promise. Over the next 13 chapters, we will trace these failures one by one. We will not sensationalize. We will not accuse. But we will ask, in a world where silence can be bought and protection sold, who can truly be safe? This is their story, their warning, their whisper through history. Listen carefully. The city of Palermo wakes early. Before the heat settles in, before the streets fill with scooters and voices, there is a brief quiet, a moment when history feels suspended. In the early 1990s, that quiet was deceptive. Sicily was at war with itself, locked in a struggle between the Italian state and an organization older, more patient, and more deeply rooted than most institutions dared admit. Francesco Marino Manoia knew this world from the inside. He was not a street thug or a peripheral figure. He was a chemist, a man who refined heroin in hidden laboratories, who understood supply chains, money flows, and the silent language of power. For years, he served the Sicilian mafia with skill and discipline. And then, in 1989, he broke the oldest rule of all. He spoke. His decision to cooperate with prosecutors was seismic. Manoia did not offer fragments or half-truths. He offered structure, names, methods, connections that linked organized crime to politics, police, and business. His testimony became a cornerstone of the Maxi trials, a judicial effort unlike anything Italy had attempted before. Hundreds of mafia members were convicted. For the first time, the state seemed stronger than the myth. Italian authorities assured Manoia that this time was different, that the era of mafia invincibility was ending. He was placed under strict witness protection, moved to secret locations, guarded around the clock. His family, too, was protected, separated for safety, monitored, watched. The promise was clear: the state would not fail again. But the mafia does not fight head-on. It waits. In July 1992, Manoia's sister, Agostina, was killed by a car bomb in Palermo. She had been under police protection. Her vehicle was supposed to be inspected, her movements monitored. Yet the bomb detonated with surgical precision, killing her instantly and injuring others nearby. It was not random violence. It was a message. The implication was unmistakable. Protection meant nothing. Later investigations revealed what many had feared, but few wanted to confront. Information about Agostina's location, routines, and security arrangements had been leaked. Police officers, sworn to uphold the law, had sold details to the very organization the state was fighting. Guard schedules, vehicle usage, vulnerabilities, everything needed to turn protection into a trap. The timing was not accidental. Just weeks earlier, Italy had been shaken by another assassination. Judge Giovanni Falcone, killed by a massive bomb planted beneath a highway. If the mafia could reach a man guarded by an entire apparatus of the state, they could reach anyone. For Manoia, the betrayal cut deeper than grief. In later interviews, his anger remained raw. He had trusted the promise. He had believed that the state could protect those who dared to stand with it. His sister died not because the mafia was powerful, but because the system meant to stop them was compromised from within. This pattern repeats across borders and cultures, not the failure of walls, but the failure of people. Witness protection does not collapse under external attack alone. It collapses when loyalty is bought, when fear outweighs duty, when information becomes currency. And yet, Manoia continued. Despite the loss, despite the knowledge that protection was imperfect, he kept testifying. His words helped dismantle networks, expose corruption, and reshape Italy's fight against organized crime. But the cost was permanent. The promise of safety had been broken, and no conviction could restore what was taken. What does it mean to ask someone to risk everything for justice? When protection fails, the risk is not abstract. It is personal. It reaches siblings, children, parents, people who never chose to testify, but pay the price anyway. The mafia understood this truth deeply. Fear, when properly targeted, is more effective than silence. As we move forward, the geography will change. The languages will shift. The organizations will wear different names. But the question remains hauntingly familiar. If protection cannot extend beyond the courtroom, how many truths will remain buried? And how many voices will choose silence, not because they are guilty, but because survival demands it? Dawn broke over Mexico City like a slow exhale, washing the streets in gold and dust. But inside the walls of a guarded safe house, silence reigned. No traffic sounds, no market stalls opening, no laughter of children playing in the courtyard. Only tension. the kind that grows when you know death might already be on its way. In 1997, a man known only as Testigo Uno, Witness 1, agreed to do what few dared, testify against the Juarez cartel. He had once been part of the machinery himself. A federal police officer pulled into the cartel's orbit by money, by threats, by the familiar methods of coercion that blur the line between law and crime. But something shifted. Call it conscience, call it survival. He began to document. He gathered names, dates, payoffs, and deals. He had seen the depths of corruption in Mexico's justice system, and he wanted out. The Attorney General's office promised him safety. They said witness protection had been reformed. He would be relocated, armed guards would surround him, and his family would be protected at a separate, undisclosed location. The safehouses were secure, the officers hand-picked and vetted. He was told that everything had changed, but in Mexico in the 1990s, change was still only an idea. The system was paper-thin. 3 weeks before his court date, gunmen descended on his safe house. It was early morning. Multiple vehicles arrived in unison, the attack executed with chilling precision. His 4 guards were gunned down in seconds. Testigo Uno was shot repeatedly. Head, chest, back, an execution, not a firefight. And that was only the beginning. Before the government could react, a second team struck 50 kilometers away. His wife and 2 children, ages 8 and 11, were under protection in a different house, with a different set of guards. That didn't matter. The attackers knew the layout, the guard schedule, the location of every room. They killed the family and vanished into the morning haze. 2 murders, 2 locations, 1 message: protection is an illusion. Investigators would later uncover a web of corruption so embedded it seemed like a second government. Officers assigned to protect witnesses had been on the cartel's payroll. The cartel had floor plans, guard names, weapon details, even the tactical training background of each officer. They had everything they needed because they'd bought it. Not with brute force, but with pesos. Some of the corrupt officials were eventually arrested. A few even confessed. But many were released quietly. Some were murdered themselves, eliminated to keep the chain of knowledge broken. And the witnesses Testigo Uno might have inspired, they disappeared. Some went silent. Others fled. The truth he had gathered died with him, or was buried in files no one dared open. This wasn't just a failure of protection. It was a system rigged from the inside, where the people tasked with shielding the truth were, in fact, delivering it to the highest bidder. What happens when even the shadows are unsafe? When the walls built to hide you become the very tools that expose you. Testigo Uno's story is not just about one man. It is a mirror reflecting the core problem of protection in a compromised state. You can lock a door, but if someone sells the key, the lock becomes meaningless. As long as loyalty is a commodity, as long as fear outpaces reform, as long as institutions can be bought, justice remains a game of risk. And those who play it often pay in blood. The cartels didn't just want him dead, they wanted his death to echo. Loud enough to warn anyone else who might consider speaking. We will find you, even if you think you're safe. Especially if you think you're safe. It started with tea. A simple cup, steeped in quiet conversation, served in a London hotel bar on an ordinary November afternoon. The Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square was no stranger to diplomats or secrets, but what unfolded there in 2006 would ripple across continents. The man sipping that tea was Alexander Litvinenko, a former officer in Russia's FSB, once entrusted with state secrets, now a defector living in the United Kingdom. He had traded his homeland for safety, his rank for a cause. Since arriving in Britain 6 years earlier, Litvinenko had become a voice, a thorn in the side of power, speaking out about Russian organized crime, state corruption, and assassinations ordered in silence. He was under British protection. He had asylum. He worked with intelligence services. He gave interviews. He believed the UK was beyond the reach of Moscow's long and punishing arm. He was wrong. That cup of tea, sipped with two former Russian contacts, carried polonium-210, a radioactive isotope so rare and lethal it could only be sourced from a nuclear facility. Within hours, Litvinenko fell ill. What doctors thought was food poisoning rapidly evolved into a mystery. Hair falling out, immune system collapse, his body shutting down in real time. It took days to identify the poison. By then, the damage was irreversible. For 3 weeks, from a hospital bed, Litvinenko withered, but he also spoke. In what became a deathbed testimony, he named names. He said the poison came from Russian agents, that President Vladimir Putin himself bore responsibility. "You may succeed in silencing one man," he wrote, "but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life." His death shocked Britain, but the method and the radioactive trail left behind was more than a message. It was a statement of capability. Traces of polonium were found in hotel rooms, on planes, in teapots, across London. The assassins had moved easily through the capital, unchallenged, unalarmed. How? Litvinenko had been a key witness. He was helping British and Spanish authorities investigate Russian crime networks. He had provided evidence of collusion between Russian intelligence and criminal syndicates. He was scheduled to testify again, yet he was not under full-time protection. No detail team, no surveillance, no safe house. British officials had believed that Russia, for all its hostility, would not dare act so brazenly on foreign soil. They miscalculated. The 2016 public inquiry confirmed the worst. The killers, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, had been acting on orders that likely came from the highest levels of the Kremlin. The British state had underestimated the cost of dissent, the lengths to which a government would go to silence a critic, even on another nation's turf. This wasn't a failure of bureaucracy. It was a failure of imagination. In the West, witness protection often assumes a criminal threat: cartels, gangs, vendettas. But Litvinenko's murder revealed a different kind of danger, one backed by a state with resources, reach, and no fear of consequences. What does protection mean in a world where borders blur and revenge wears a diplomatic passport? Litvinenko's death was not just an assassination. It was an erasure of trust, of assumptions, of safety. The message was deliberate. Not even exile can save you. Not even London is far enough. The silence after his death was filled not with justice, but with radiation. Invisible, lingering, and impossible to ignore. He was promised protection. He got a funeral. And the world was reminded, some enemies don't need to break in. They just walk through the front door carrying poison in a teacup and leave through customs with a smile. How do you protect someone from that? Brussels is a city of quiet facades, rows of orderly buildings, diplomatic plaques, and cobblestone streets that hide the nervous pulse of Europe's secrets. In 2003, behind one such facade, a man sat in a high-rise apartment guarded by armed officers, watching the sky change over the rooftops. He had been promised safety. The Belgian government said no one knew where he was. But somewhere in that silence, someone was watching. The witness, whose name was never publicly revealed, had once belonged to an Albanian crime network that trafficked women, drugs, and death across Europe. He had lived that life for years, moving heroin from Turkey through the Balkans, overseeing human trafficking routes, watching lives traded like currency. But in a rare and dangerous turn, he turned himself in. He was tired, he said, tired of blood, of fear, of silence. In exchange for his cooperation, he was placed in the Belgian Witness Protection Program. Prosecutors called him the Keystone, a witness who could name names, provide locations, describe how the network laundered money and bought silence. His testimony could bring down a cross-border web of violence. The apartment where he lived was meant to be secure. Cameras at every entrance. 2 police officers stationed inside at all times. An upper-floor unit accessible only through a locked, guarded stairwell. His presence there was known only to a small, trusted circle. And yet, on a cold March night, the building went quiet for just long enough. Gunmen entered. Professional. Swift. They killed the 2 officers first, then the witness. Multiple shots. Close range. The job was done in minutes. Then they vanished into the city. No signs of forced entry. No camera footage that caught them. Just precision. Just knowledge. The investigation didn't take long to turn inward. Someone had talked. It was a police officer, not one of the guards, but someone behind the scenes. A coordinator in the protection program. Deeply in debt. Desperate. And then approached by the Albanian gang. They offered him 50,000 euros. He took it. In return, he gave them everything: the address, the floor plan, the rotation schedule of the guards, the blind spots in the camera system, even the likely time of day the witness would be most vulnerable. It was enough. When investigators followed the money trail, they found suspicious deposits, burner phones, quiet meetings. Confronted with the evidence, the officer confessed. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the damage was irreversible. The case collapsed. Without the witness, the prosecutions unraveled. The traffickers walked free. Belgium's witness protection system was shaken to its core. A full audit revealed structural weaknesses. Too many people had access to sensitive information. Financial oversight of officers was lacking, and no system existed to monitor for internal threats. They made changes. Compartmentalized information. Instituted background checks and financial surveillance for officers. But by then, the lesson had already been carved into the city's skin. In a system where secrecy is survival, one corrupt insider is all it takes to destroy everything. The man in that apartment followed the rules. He stayed hidden. He trusted the plan. But the plan didn't account for the cost of human desperation. For a cop with gambling debts and no loyalty to anything but a briefcase of cash. This was not a failure of strength. It was a failure of character. Protection is not just about walls, guards, or cameras. It's about trust. And in this case, that trust was sold. For 50,000 euros, a man died. And the question lingers. In a world where loyalty has a price, can any protection be truly secure? The Hague, Netherlands. A city built on law. Quiet canals winding past international courts and embassies where justice is more than a principle. It's an industry. But even in this global capital of accountability, protection can be an illusion. In 2000, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia prepared to hear testimony from a key witness. He had seen horrors during the Bosnian War, mass executions, ethnic cleansing, the systematic use of rape as a weapon. His words were meant to bring clarity to chaos, justice to wounds that still bled beneath the surface of Europe. He was housed in a secure apartment. His name was redacted from court documents, replaced by a number. Only a select group of tribunal officials and vetted security personnel knew his identity. The walls were soundproof, the surveillance constant. And yet, one morning in June, he was found dead, hanging in his apartment. At first, it was ruled a suicide. The official story was simple: stress, regret, perhaps fear. But forensic evidence began to whisper a different tale. Defensive wounds on his hands, bruises inconsistent with self-harm, ligature marks that didn't match the improvised noose. The scene, investigators later determined, had been staged. He hadn't taken his own life. Someone had taken it for him. But who? The answer was murky, layered in bureaucracy, plausible deniability, and silence. Later investigations pointed to a network of leaks. Somewhere in the Balkans, despite witness anonymity, someone had pieced together his identity. That information passed through channels, intelligence services, diaspora networks, organized crime remnants still loyal to the war's architects. Eventually, the location of the witness reached those who wanted him silenced. The exact mechanism of the breach was never fully confirmed. Perhaps it was a tribunal employee with ethnic loyalties, perhaps a guard with ties to the old world. Or maybe it was just carelessness, a name spoken in the wrong room, an address left in an unsecured file. What is certain is that someone inside the system allowed the violence of the past to reach into the heart of Western Europe. The tribunal responded with reforms, tighter vetting, deeper background checks, better compartmentalization. But it was too late. The witness was dead, his testimony lost. And his death sent a tremor through the international justice community. Other witnesses withdrew. Some went into hiding. A few simply disappeared. This was not just a murder. It was a message. Even here, in the sanctuary of law and diplomacy, old wars have long arms. International justice depends on bravery, on survivors willing to relive trauma in front of strangers, to name names, to challenge power. But that bravery is fragile. It can only exist when trust is earned, when witnesses believe the system will protect them. When that belief is shattered, the entire process falters. This man had risked everything to tell the truth. He had escaped the war zone, entered the fortress of justice, and placed his life in the hands of those who promised he would be safe. They failed him, not through malice, through neglect. In the architecture of international law, the greatest vulnerability isn't the complexity of the cases or the power of the accused. It's the fragile chain of human hands that carries each witness from fear to testimony. One weak link, and everything collapses. His death is a footnote now, a sealed file in a drawer, a redacted name on a list. But it should be more. It should be a warning. Justice that cannot protect its witnesses is not justice. It is theater. And no verdict can undo the silence that follows a murder masked as suicide, not even in The Hague. The sun was high over Manila when the shots rang out, a hot August afternoon in 2017, traffic choking the streets, people moving in every direction. The witness had just stepped outside his apartment, following instructions from someone he believed was part of his protection detail. It was supposed to be a security check-in. Instead, it was an execution. He died in the open, in front of witnesses, gunned down by two men on a motorcycle, a method so common in the Philippines it has its own name. Riding in tandem. A clean, fast hit. The killers vanished into traffic before anyone could react. He was supposed to be safe. He had done everything right. He had been a police informant, a man who knew how the system worked because he had worked inside it. In the early years of President Rodrigo Duterte's controversial war on drugs, he had helped authorities identify suspects, map out local networks. But somewhere along the way, the violence consumed him, too. He saw officers plant evidence. He saw suspects executed in alleys and labeled resisting arrest. And he saw the machinery that made it all look legal. When he chose to testify, his evidence was damning. Not just about individual officers, but about patterns, policies. He said the killings weren't rogue acts. They were systemic, sanctioned. He could name names, dates, locations. It was enough to launch a human rights investigation, enough to suggest crimes against humanity. The Department of Justice enrolled him in witness protection. He was moved to a secure location, given a new identity, a direct phone line for emergencies. They promised he was out of harm's way. But someone had that number. The day of his murder, he received a call. The voice on the line identified itself as a coordinator from the protection unit. They asked him to step outside, to a public location nearby, for a scheduled security debrief. They referenced details from his case. They used the correct codes. He obeyed. Minutes later, he was dead. The Department of Justice said he had broken protocol, that he had exposed himself. But independent investigators traced the phone call to an internal government line, one supposedly limited to protection staff. No arrest was ever made. No one claimed responsibility. No one explained how a protected witness could be lured into the open by a voice that knew exactly what to say. Human rights groups were clear. This was a targeted killing, and the betrayal came from within. In the months that followed, fear rippled through the ranks of other informants. Several who had agreed to testify in drug war cases withdrew their cooperation. A few fled the country. Others went into hiding on their own, choosing invisibility over state protection. The risk was too great. The system, they believed, could no longer be trusted. This was not about one man. It was about the collapse of a promise. Witness protection depends on secrecy, yes, but more than that, it depends on faith. Faith that the people handling your case are not also protecting your enemies. Faith that the call telling you where to go isn't a trap. Faith that the state wants justice more than silence. In the Philippines, during those years, that faith was shredded. The witness died alone, betrayed by the very mechanism meant to save him. His death was not just a statistic in a brutal campaign. It was a message sent with bullets, a warning carved into the pavement. Even if you speak the truth, even if you trust the state, even if you follow every rule, we can still find you. And we can still make you disappear, not despite protection, because of it. It happened in America, not in a war zone, not in a failed state, but in a quiet, mid-sized city in the southeastern United States, a place chosen precisely because it was unremarkable. In 2009, a Colombian drug informant living under a new identity was gunned down in broad daylight outside a grocery store, his groceries still in the cart, his steps frozen mid-return to the car. He had done everything right. After years inside a major Colombian trafficking network, he'd flipped, providing U.S. authorities with critical testimony. He named smuggling routes, mapped out laundering operations, and exposed connections between cartels and public officials. His cooperation led to indictments, seizures, and arrests on 2 continents. For that, he was granted entry into the U.S. Marshals Service Witness Security Program, WITSEC, widely regarded as the most secure witness protection system in the world. New name, new life, no contact with the past. His location known only to a select group of handlers. He lived quietly, avoided attention, followed every rule, until someone found him. The shooting was clean and fast. A single assailant approached from behind, fired several rounds into his back and head, and walked away. The killer disappeared into a waiting car, leaving no trace, no camera footage, no identification. Just a dead man with a fabricated name and a life meant to be untouchable. The question wasn't just who did it. It was how. The investigation uncovered 2 troubling threads. First, despite strict WITSEC rules, the informant had made limited contact with his family in Colombia. Short calls, burner phones, no names, no addresses. But the cartel was listening. They had the technology. By triangulating cell tower data and comparing it with known resettlement patterns, they narrowed down the region. They didn't need a city or street, just a zone. The second breach came from within the legal system. Court documents related to his testimony had been insufficiently redacted. While his new identity wasn't directly exposed, the filings included contextual clues, vague geographic references, timelines, procedural notes. Individually, nothing conclusive. But in the hands of someone determined, the puzzle pieces formed a shape, and someone had been putting them together. A paralegal working on a defense team had conducted suspicious searches, digging into WITSEC procedures, matching old aliases to possible locations. While they were never charged, investigators discovered a network through which information flowed, shared, sold, passed along like contraband. It was never clear who made the final connection or who pulled the trigger. But the message was unmistakable. Even WITSEC isn't perfect. The program had not been infiltrated directly. No marshals were bribed. No files stolen. But the ecosystem around the witness, courtrooms, clerks, legal aids, had weak points. And the cartel didn't need certainty. They needed only probability. They cast a wide net and eventually found him. One call too many, one document too careless. That's all it took. In the aftermath, WITSEC reviewed its protocols. Redaction standards were tightened. Communication monitoring increased. Training on indirect data exposure was expanded, but the damage was done. The myth of impenetrability had cracked. And the witness? He became a ghost twice over. First erased from his past, then erased from the future he was promised. There is a chilling irony in his story. He had escaped the violence of Colombia, had trusted in the strength of a new country, had given the justice system everything he knew. And he was killed not because he made a mistake, but because others did. He believed he was safe, and that belief was fatal. Even the best protection cannot defend against every shadow, especially when the light is leaking from within. In Athens, the walls of a police facility echoed with silence on a spring morning in 2013. The man inside was once part of Greece's violent undercurrent, a member of a domestic terrorist organization that had left its fingerprints across decades of unrest. Bombings, assassinations, attacks on state buildings. He had planted devices. He had watched institutions tremble. But then he turned. His decision to testify came with a price, and the state promised to pay it. He was placed in a high-security detention center, monitored around the clock. His name was erased from records, his location known only to a few. Greek authorities said they understood the threat, that within their ranks there were sympathizers. That political violence in Greece had deep roots and loyal echoes. But they insisted this time things were under control. Then he was found hanging in his cell. It was ruled a suicide. The cell was designed to prevent it. No exposed fixtures, no ligature points. The bed sheets were too short, the bars too low. Yet the official report said he had taken his own life in the dead of night, without a sound, without resistance. But the body told another story. Defensive wounds on his hands, bruises across his arms and back, neck injuries inconsistent with hanging, the marks of restraint, the signs of struggle. Forensic experts pushed back. Human rights observers cried foul. His family demanded answers. None came. Behind the locked doors and security cameras, something had gone terribly wrong, or perhaps terribly right, depending on whose plan it had been. No one was ever charged. The officers on duty that night each had plausible reasons for where they were. None could be placed at the scene. But investigations later revealed something darker beneath the surface. Connections between law enforcement personnel and extremist political factions. Shared ideology. Old alliances. Quiet nods passed between uniforms and insurgents. In Greece, political violence was never just about ideology. It was about identity. Who belonged, who betrayed, who deserved protection, and who deserved none. The informant had crossed a line, not just from violence to cooperation, but from myth to accountability. He was meant to testify against individuals who, despite their crimes, still held a certain underground reverence. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a risk. And someone acted. His death sent a shiver through the justice system. Several other witnesses in similar cases withdrew. Trials were delayed. Others collapsed. Fear returned, but not from the threat of bombs, from the realization that the state could not protect its own. This wasn't a cartel. This wasn't the mafia. This was ideology, alive inside the very walls meant to contain it. In cases like this, protection isn't just about secrecy. It's about belief, that the state is neutral, that it wants the truth, not vengeance, that it values the life of a witness over the politics of the moment. But when belief fades, so does cooperation. The man in that cell trusted a promise that the system would guard him while he tried to dismantle what he once upheld. But protection built on blind faith crumbles easily in the presence of silent enemies. Enemies not in the streets, but in the halls. Not in masks, but in uniforms. In the end, his death was not a single act of violence, but the final collapse of an illusion. Even behind the thickest doors, if those with keys are not loyal to justice, the lock means nothing. Belfast, 1982. The troubles were far from over. Streets bore the scars of years of conflict. Burnt-out cars, shuttered storefronts, murals painted in defiance. In this divided land, lines weren't just drawn between communities. They ran through families, through police stations, even through memory itself. That year, a man crossed a line no one was supposed to. A former IRA member, he agreed to become Curry Supergrass, the British term for an informant who would testify against dozens of his former comrades. He had blood on his hands. But now he wanted out, and more than that, he wanted to help dismantle the machine he had helped operate. His cooperation was seismic. He named names, described weapons caches, detailed bombing plans, and mapped the internal structure of the IRA. British authorities were jubilant. His testimony could lead to the largest wave of prosecutions in Northern Ireland's history. Over 40 arrests hinged on his words. They moved quickly. He was placed in a secure facility under the watch of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC. The message was clear. He would be protected. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a witness, a tool for peace. And then, one morning, they found him dead. Official reports called it suicide, a hanging in his cell. But his family didn't believe it. Neither did independent observers. He had been optimistic. He was making plans for a new life, far from Belfast. His letters home were full of hope, not despair. Autopsy reports raised red flags. Unexplained bruises, marks suggesting restraint, injuries inconsistent with hanging. Rumors spread quickly. He hadn't died by his own hand. He had been silenced, not by the IRA from the outside, but by betrayal from within. Years later, declassified documents revealed disturbing truths. British intelligence had received warnings. Sources inside the RUC had reported potential leaks, whispers that some officers harbored Republican sympathies or were under threat from IRA operatives. There were even allegations that the IRA had managed to infiltrate the very agency tasked with protecting the supergrass, but the warnings went unheeded, or perhaps worse, were ignored. The exact method of his death remains murky. Some believe a door was left unlocked. Others think his cell was deliberately placed in a blind spot. No one was ever charged. No definitive answers were given. Only the silence of a closed case and the lingering suspicion that he had been handed over, quietly, as a sacrificial exchange. The fallout was immediate. The mass prosecution collapsed. Without their star witness, the cases against dozens of IRA members disintegrated. The British government's bold strategy of turning insiders against the insurgency was dealt a fatal blow. And future informants? They vanished. The lesson was clear. Not even the British state could protect you if you betrayed the IRA. The supergrass strategy, once heralded as the key to ending the violence, was abandoned in shame. In the decades since, Northern Ireland has tried to move forward, but justice for those years remains elusive. So many truths never told, so many voices silenced by fear or by murder. And behind every silence, a question remains. If you can't protect someone in a high-security facility with armed guards and locked doors, what does protection mean at all? For that man, it meant nothing. He crossed a line, believed in the system, and was met not with safety, but with a noose in the night and a silence that still hangs over Belfast like fog. Some betrayals come from across the street. Others come from the room next door. There's a rhythm to violence in Colombia, a pulse that beats beneath jungle canopies and city alleys alike. In 2005, one man tried to break free from that rhythm. He was a high-ranking member of a drug cartel, steeped in the cocaine trade, fluent in roots, money laundering, and the bribes that made it all invisible. But when the walls closed in, he made a different choice. He testified. His cooperation was invaluable. He outlined the cartel's structure, detailed international shipping routes, and exposed how the organization had infiltrated law enforcement on both sides of the border. In return, he was promised a new life, not just safety, but transformation. The United States offered him that. He entered WITSEC, the U.S. Marshal Service's Witness Security Program. A new name, a new identity. A quiet city in the southeast where no one knew him, where his past was just a closed file in a sealed court. For a time, it worked. He lived quietly, no contact with former associates, no digital footprint, no ties to Colombia. He followed every protocol, every instruction. He was, by all accounts, a model participant in the program. Then, in 2009, as he stepped outside a local grocery store, he was shot to death. One man, one shooter, multiple rounds to the chest and head. The assassin disappeared into a waiting vehicle. No witnesses, no clear motive to the outside world. But WITSEC knew he had been found. The investigation was a slow unraveling. First, a minor infraction. Despite the rules, he had made occasional calls to his elderly mother in Colombia. Always from burner phones, always short, always careful. But careful isn't invisible. The cartel, always listening, triangulated the calls. They couldn't pinpoint a street, but they could isolate a region. That was enough. Then came the deeper breach. Documents tied to his testimony, sealed, supposedly secure, had been filed in U.S. federal court. But some weren't redacted carefully enough. A mention of the Southeast, a reference to relocation procedures, a name left in a document's metadata. Clues that alone meant nothing. But in the hands of professionals, they formed a map. The killers followed it. WITSEC hadn't failed in its core responsibilities, but the system surrounding it had cracks. Legal processes, support staff, defense teams, people with access who weren't trained to think like predators. One paralegal on a defense team had run suspicious searches, combining the witness's former identity with potential resettlement cities. No law was broken, no charges filed. But somewhere along the chain, that information leaked, and the cartel was waiting. This wasn't just an assassination. It was a demonstration that even in America, where witness protection is a gold standard, no one is beyond reach if enough people stop paying attention. That sometimes you don't need to bribe an agent. You just need to read between the redacted lines. The witness believed he had escaped. He believed that miles and paperwork and a new name were enough. But information is the new currency of violence, and someone, somewhere, sold his future for a price. This case forced a reckoning. Redaction procedures were overhauled. Court document handling was reevaluated. But no reform can undo a death. No policy can make a widow whole. The man who died outside that grocery store had helped dismantle one of the largest drug networks in the Western Hemisphere. And he paid with his life, not in Colombia, but on American soil. Justice had offered him protection, but it forgot to protect him from its own paperwork. And in that oversight, the cartel found its window. Not every murder requires a conspiracy. Sometimes it only takes a clerical error and a man who still misses his mother. In 2006, the body of justice was buried beneath bureaucracy, not in a courtroom, not in a back alley, but in a secure, windowless office in Brussels, where promises were made, documents were signed, and lives were supposed to begin again. This was where witness protection started, and where, in one tragic case, it silently failed. The witness was anonymous by law. A former member of an Albanian crime syndicate, he had seen the worst of what Eastern Europe's post-war chaos had created. Trafficking networks stretching from the Balkans to Belgium, heroin pipelines, weapons caches, and women bought and sold like property. He wasn't a small player. He had helped build the machine, but he broke. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the tightening noose around his own neck, he came forward. He testified. The Belgian authorities responded swiftly. They relocated him to a fortified apartment in Brussels, high security, top floor, with 24-hour armed police presence. He was guarded by 2 officers at all times. Surveillance cameras monitored the corridors. The location was top secret, restricted to a vetted circle of officials. And yet, on a quiet morning in March, he was executed. 2 professional killers entered the building. They moved past the surveillance, reached the correct floor, entered the apartment, and killed the guards first. Then they shot the witness. Multiple rounds. Precise. Efficient. No security breach was recorded. No alarm was triggered. The cameras missed them. The locks failed. The killers escaped as easily as they arrived. The investigation turned inward, as it always does when the impossible becomes real. They didn't have to look far. One of the officers involved in coordinating the protection program had a gambling problem. Debts that shadowed his salary, pressures mounting behind a stoic uniform. The Albanian gang found him, and for $50,000, he gave them everything: the address, the layout of the apartment, guard shifts, even blind spots in the camera system. He was arrested weeks later. The money trail was sloppy, his phone records damning. Faced with the evidence, he confessed. Not to hatred, not to ideology, just desperation. He had debts. They offered a way out, and for that, a man died. The case fell apart. Without the witness, the prosecutions crumbled. Over 30 gang members were released. The syndicate flourished. Belgium's witness protection system went into crisis. Reviews were launched. Flaws were exposed. Too many officials with access to sensitive information, inadequate financial monitoring of protection officers, no systems to detect insider threats. Reforms were made, new layers added, but the question still lingers. How do you build a wall high enough to keep out betrayal? Witness protection is built on trust, not just between a witness and the state, but within the state itself, between colleagues, between departments, between the silent hands moving behind the scenes. When just one hand is for sale, the entire system collapses. The witness in that apartment wasn't killed because he slipped up. He wasn't careless. He wasn't arrogant. He was betrayed by someone whose job was to protect him. Betrayed for a sum that wouldn't buy a car. Betrayed for a chance to wipe out a personal mistake. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a transaction. And the cost wasn't just one life, it was trust. How many other witnesses have gone silent because of that day? How many never even come forward now, whispering to themselves in the dark, "They'll sell me too." The system only works if every link in the chain holds. But in Brussels, one broke. And when it did, the silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. The war had officially ended, but for one man, the battlefield never disappeared. It was the year 2000, and he had agreed to testify before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, a body created to hold war criminals accountable for the atrocities of the Bosnian conflict. Mass graves, ethnic cleansing, the weaponization of rape. He carried truth in his memory, names, places, faces. And that truth was dangerous. He was promised protection. Moved to the Netherlands, placed in a secure apartment, his identity redacted from every public record. He was now a number, not a name. A ghost hiding in the architecture of justice. But ghosts can still bleed. When he was found dead in his apartment, the initial report said suicide. A quiet end. A man overwhelmed by guilt, perhaps, or fear, but that explanation dissolved under scrutiny. Forensic experts found bruising on his body, defensive wounds, signs of restraint. Ligature marks that suggested he had been strangled, not hanged. The hanging was a cover, a staged scene designed to mislead. And, for a time, it worked. But beneath the surface, a more troubling story began to take shape. The leak, as always, came from within. Tribunal documents were meant to be sealed, encrypted, tightly controlled. But someone, or someone within the system, had connections to the very networks the witness was testifying against. Diaspora ties, political sympathies, financial incentives. There were whispers of tribunal staff with Balkan origins, of loyalty bleeding across borders, of conversations held in kitchens rather than courtrooms. The information traveled, not formally, not digitally, but through human corridors, family ties, ideological echoes, silent favors owed. Eventually, it reached people who knew what to do with it. The witness was silenced before he could take the stand. In the aftermath, the tribunal scrambled. Internal reviews were launched. New security protocols were implemented. Vetting intensified. But none of it changed the fact that a witness had been murdered under UN protection. That even in a city built to safeguard justice, the very process had been compromised by the oldest vulnerability: divided loyalties. Other witnesses took notice. Some refused to testify. Others demanded to be relocated again, farther away. A few disappeared completely. Cases built over years unraveled. Suspects who should have faced judgment walked free. Because of one leak. Because one person, maybe more, decided that a shared language, or belief, or price mattered more than a man's life. The tribunal learned something that day, that you can build the most sophisticated protection system in the world, but it means nothing if you can't trust the people inside it. This wasn't the mafia. It wasn't a cartel. It was justice undone by whispers, not bullets. The witness wasn't naive. He knew the risks, but he believed that distance meant safety. That the Hague was far enough from Sarajevo. That international institutions were stronger than old grudges. He was wrong. And so another voice was lost, another story untold, another truth buried, not under rubble or war, but beneath the polite language of policy failures and internal reviews. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a verdict. And it asked the same question all these stories do. If the keepers of justice cannot protect those who speak for it, what justice is left to keep? 10 lives, 10 stories, 10 failures, from Boston to Palermo, Mexico City to The Hague. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were warnings, each one louder than the last. Witnesses who came forward with truth in their hands, only to be met with betrayal wrapped in promises. They believed in something bigger than themselves, in justice, in protection, in the idea that by speaking up, they could stop something dark from spreading. But what they didn't see, or couldn't believe, was that the danger wasn't only outside, it was inside. Inside the agencies sworn to protect them. Inside the courtrooms that relied on their words. Inside the very systems designed to defend the idea of truth. John McIntyre followed every rule, but an FBI agent working for Whitey Bulger gave him up. Francesco Manoia's sister was blown apart because Sicilian police officers sold her location. Testigo Uno and his family were executed in 2 simultaneous strikes, their lives traded for money by men wearing badges. Litvinenko drank poisoned tea in London because the system underestimated the reach of the state he fled. A Belgian cop, desperate and indebted, sold a witness's address for 50,000 euros. In every case, the pattern is the same. It's not that the walls weren't tall enough. It's that someone opened a door from the inside. What do these deaths teach us? That protection is not a physical thing. It's a moral one. No safe house, no escort, no change of name can defend against the one element no system can fully control: human choice, the decision to stay loyal, or to sell it, to value a life, or to trade it. And perhaps that's the deepest tragedy of all, that these witnesses didn't die because the criminals outwitted the system. They died because the system didn't believe it needed protecting from itself. In each of these stories, someone made a choice to place trust in a machine that was already rusting from within. Can we blame them? Can we fault them for wanting to believe that truth was enough? We shouldn't. Because every time a witness is murdered after cooperating, something larger dies with them: a future confession that never happens, a case that never gets solved, a network that survives another day because fear did its job. So what are we left with? A bitter truth: that justice, for all its symbols and rituals, is only as strong as the people who uphold it. And when those people fall, to fear, to money, to silence, the entire idea collapses. But there's also something else. Even in betrayal, these stories reveal something human and haunting: the bravery it takes to speak up, knowing the risk. To trust even when trust has been broken before. To believe, in the face of death, that your voice might matter. We remember these 10 not only for how they died, but for what they tried to do. They believed that truth was worth the cost. And in remembering them, we carry their question forward: can we build a system that deserves that kind of courage? Or will we keep burying the voices we promised to protect? The next time someone sits across from a prosecutor holding the weight of a decision that could change everything, their safety, their family, their future, what will we have waiting for them? A promise or a lie? That answer is still ours to give, and it starts by listening, truly listening to the silence they left behind.